Today we welcome from Problem Gambling Services, Jeremy Wampler. Jeremy is a clinical supervisor for the state of Connecticut, Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, Problem Gambling Services. Jeremy earned his Master in Social Work from Southern Connecticut State University and has been practicing in the field of problem gambling since 2007. He serves on an International Gambling Counselor Certification Board and has served on the board of the National Association of Administrators for Disordered Gambling Services. In his current role as a state administrator, Jeremy provides oversight for all statewide problem gambling services, which include problem gambling specific clinical services, disordered gambling integration programs, outreach and engagement, prevention and recovery support services. Jeremy is an advocate and trainer providing education and technical assistance for key stakeholders throughout the state and has begun expanding training and technical assistance to other states throughout the New England region, with a focus and passion on building capacity of clinical workforce and supporting the growing needs of other service administrators in the problem gambling field. Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services and the consortium welcomes Jeremy and thanks him for presenting this morning.
I'm Valerie Tebbetts. I am the manager of Helpline Training and Recovery Services for the Connecticut Council on Problem Gambling. I have been there for the last almost 3 years now. Formerly, I was a peer counselor at the Better Choice Treatment Program at UCFS Healthcare in Norwich. I also have worked as a recovery coach in a substance use medication-assisted treatment program. I am a person in long-term recovery. I've been in recovery since 2010, and I will leave it there.
Problem gambling, as we know in our work, it's one of those things that's we consider the hidden addiction, oftentimes not recognized, but it's wildly pervasive in our communities and in our culture. Hopefully you'll walk away with some tidbits of information. It is not a long presentation, so we're just going to do kind of a broad overview of some highlights around problem gambling and trauma, why we should care, and maybe why we should start screening and having conversations around problem gambling and how it's influencing people's behaviors and their lives. So to start this presentation, like any other presentation, we never like to assume that people know what we're talking about when we talk about gambling. Gambling, could mean different things to different people based on your own experience, background, or what have you. So we'll kind of like to lay a baseline definition of when we're talking about gambling, what we're talking about. So gambling is betting money or material goods on an event or with an uncertain outcome in the hopes of winning additional money or material goods, right? So it's really important that people understand that it's not only finances that people are gambling with. A lot of times, depending on a person's situation, especially when we're talking about youth, people who are incarcerated, sometimes people are betting, things of value, possessions, things like that. So we like to just put that out there that gambling it's much wider than just financial. There are some other terms that you may hear floating around when people are talking about gambling. One of the things the industry really promotes, and we also promote ourselves, is responsible gambling. If you've ever paid attention in the past, there used to be a motto at the end of every commercial for lottery or usually lottery. It would say, "Please play responsibly." And what we know from experience and from data and from just talking with folks, that doesn't really mean much, right? It's like saying, please drink responsibly. And that's all based on your own perception or your own belief system. So I could say I drink responsibly because I use a designated driver when I go to the bar. I can go to the bar every day of the week, but as long as I have a designated driver, I feel that I'm drinking responsibly. Well, we know in our field that there's probably more to it. So responsible gambling has kind of evolved to giving people some parameters around what responsible gambling is, what are some safety and protective measures that they can take to avoid having any problems. Because one of the other things that we know in our work, and when we go out and we do focus groups and we work with communities, is when we start talking about gambling, a a lot of people don't even have a basic knowledge of gambling, right? They might know somebody who gambles, but a lot of times they kind of gravitate towards images they've seen on TV or in the media. We don't do any, there's no education in the school system around, responsible or safe play. We don't have the same kind of infrastructure that we have for drugs and alcohol with youth. So we, in our work, one of the things, our responsibilities is helping educate people on how to, if they do choose to participate, how to do so safely. And if they do start to run into problems, what those problems look like and where they can seek help. So responsible gambling is kind of all of that encompassed. And that's something that we partner with the industry on, partner with the Connecticut Council on Problem Gambling. We have a van that travels throughout the state that people can book. And it's all around responsible play. We are neutral in terms of gambling. We're not for or against it, but we are about educating people about resources and how to keep things safe and affordable. And then we move into problem gambling, which is just essentially people are starting to run into some issues related to their gambling. Not something that's really debilitating yet or at all for people, but maybe there's some financial issues, maybe they're gambling more than intended, maybe they're not paying attention to their families or their work or whatever. So problems are starting to seep in, but it's not something that's really causing significant harm, but there's definitely something to kind of take note of. And then we have gambling disorder, which is a DSM-5 diagnosis, where you have to meet 4 of the 9 criteria. That's typically the folks who enter into our treatment system are people who have diagnosis of gambling disorder. So that's just kind of a broad overview of some terms that you may hear. And gambling, like many other addictions or many other issues, kind of lives on a continuum, right? So it's not so black and white where it's either you have a gambling issue or you're not. People fall within a range, and at any given time they can kind of move throughout this range. So we have people who totally abstain, who choose not to participate, all the way up to people who have a gambling disorder, right? And research shows, and this is pretty consistent internationally. We recently had an impact study conducted in Connecticut, and our numbers are the same. Pretty much you can figure about 1 to 2% of the general population have a significant gambling issue that would qualify for a gambling disorder diagnosis. So in Connecticut, our study found about 1.8%, so we're within that range. And to put that into perspective, about 2% of our population is about 60 to 70,000 people in our state. So it's pretty, 1 to 2% doesn't sound so much, but when we put some numbers to it, 60,000 people, that's quite a bit of people who are affected by this in a negative way. And then you have people who have the gambling problems where, they might meet a couple criteria, they're starting to experience some issues. That's about 3 to 4%, so that's about roughly 120,000 people. And then we have, at risk, right, where people are kind of on that borderline, making risky bets, making risky decisions, but, not necessarily crossing over into that problem area. But what we know is about 95% of folks who gamble or don't gamble, general population, fall within this range where they don't have an issue. And those are the folks that we really focus on educating, providing some prevention services so that we can hopefully avoid them kind of crossing over into some of that problematic or more addictive kind of behavior. And then like any other issue, we have our subgroups that are at higher risk. Obviously, no surprise to most people, youth are double the risk. I think that's probably true for most things, right? So youth are at double the risk, especially, in our state back in October of 2021, we legalized online and sports wagering. And that really, we're starting to see that impact younger folks even more so. So I suspect this number might change at some point. But for now, the research that we have currently shows youth about double the rate of the general adult population. Veterans are about 3.5 times the rate of general population. And we'll talk a little bit about that during today's presentation. Athletes, about 4 times, and particularly around sports wagering, right? So athletes, sometimes a very competitive group of people, sometimes feel that they have an inside knowledge or, important knowledge for making picks. So, really appealing to the sports betting market. A lot of athletes, and if you watch sports or anything like that, you'll see why that might be. You see, lines are constantly being promoted and talked about. Now that everything's legal pretty much throughout most of the country, you're seeing more and more shows around, making bets and making parlays and all the rest of it. So really kind of tapping into that market. Folks who are struggling with substance use and mental health issues, about 10 times the rate. So if you are working with folks who are dealing with substance use or mental health issues, it's really important that we're doing some screening and talking about, if gambling is also co-occurring with the other issues that they're dealing with. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And then within the corrections population, we are seeing about 20 times the rate of problem gambling. We actually conducted a survey in Connecticut prisons back in several years ago. I think it was maybe 18 or a little bit before that, and we found that about 30 to 35%, depending on the facility, of people who were incarcerated who were surveyed had significant gambling issues while incarcerated. So, or gambling was one of the factors that led them to become incarcerated. So it's a significant issue, one that's really an untapped population. We've done a lot of work with the population, but not nearly enough, and we need to do more. But so if you're working with any of these groups, even more reason to do some screening and have some conversations, if nothing else. Some of the symptoms, and you may notice there's a strong correlation between substance use or other addictions, right? So relationship problems, financial problems, including bankruptcy, legal issues, work performance, general health. Obviously, if you're kind of preoccupied with placing bets or gambling, you're not taking care of a lot of other factors in your life. Poor health. We have high rates of suicide. We'll talk a little bit about that. Family discord, domestic violence is a big thing, as well as intimate partner violence and child abuse, along with co-occurring substances, which I kind of mentioned in the previous slide. So the impacts on significant others, so the National Council on Problem Gambling found that about for every one person struggling with a gambling issue, it impacts about 7 to 20. And I realize that's a wide range, but it could be as little as impacting the immediate family, up into people who have embezzled money from organizations or from their companies. Obviously, they're going to impact more people as a result of that behavior. So about 7 to 20 people are impacted by one person's gambling. So if you go back to our prevalence slide, if you have 60,000, now this is going to get kind of fuzzy because I'm a social worker like most people, and math is not my strong suit, but I'm just going to put it out there, like for every 60,000 people, right, who in Connecticut have a gambling issue, multiply it by 7, and that's how many people are impacted. So you can do the math. It's a lot. And again, just kind of reaffirming why we need to care about this issue more. In terms of trauma, things that might be of interest to this group, intimate partner violence and child maltreatment among individuals with problem gambling. It says pathological gambling in this because pathological gambling was the previous name in DSM-IV and previous, and DSM-V it changed to gambling disorder. And when this study was done, it was in DSM-IV time, so they called it pathological gambling. So in terms of dating violence, about 6 to 12 times greater than those who didn't gamble. marital violence, about 20 times greater, and then severe child abuse about 13 times greater. And that's the study that was done in 2009. I will also like to kind of just highlight that I understand this is 2009. That's quite a long time ago. We like to give statistics and data that's 10 years or newer. Unfortunately, there's not, we don't have the same sort of parity, nor do we have the same sort of funding in problem gambling to do these ongoing studies to see where we're at. 2009 was a very, the landscape of gambling in our country was very different. So I would be interested to see, in the future, if somebody does more research, if these numbers have changed with online options, because we know with the increased accessibility, we have increased rates of people who participate. And I just wonder if that's going to have a significant impact on some of these numbers. But as of this study in 2009, that's what they found, and that's the latest. And in terms of, IPV, there was a study conducted of 248 people who gamble. 43 were women, 205 were men. That's also kind of consistent with research. We tend to find more men in these studies than women, although we're starting to see that change a little bit. So about 63% reported perpetrating or being the victim of IPV. About 64.5% had clinically significant anger, which I'm curious. I was trying to find the study so I could see what they qualified as clinically significant anger. But whatever measure they use, about 64.5% people met that. And then the presence of lifetime substance use disorder and anger problems increase the likelihood of IPV, which I think is probably true across the board with other things as well. But again, the importance when we're talking about substances to include gambling into that conversation. And Val, I think you're up, right? Or is this still?
Thanks, Jeremy. Yep, I'm here. So, Jeremy, you're going to have to move my slides for me, which I'm a little terrified, but you're sharing your screen, right?
I got it. I got you.
You sure?
Yeah.
Okay. So I was recently fortunate enough to attend the National Conference on Problem Gambling in San Diego. And at the conference, a woman named Kristen Beal from the Maryland Center on Excellence in Problem Gambling, which is affiliated with the University of Maryland. She's a clinical director there, and she has focused some of her attention on this particular topic, gambling and domestic and intimate partner violence. And she did a workshop there. And I want to give her full credit for some of the content of these slides. This is not her slides, but I thought that it was a really opportune time to share with you guys as much as I could boil down some of the content, because as Jeremy said, it's like this research just isn't out there. Every time I turn to look, the proportions of men to women of who get studied as gamblers is pretty much the same as it's traditionally been across the world. There are also more men who gamble than women still, as a percentage of the population. So, the limited dollars that we have a tendency to be focused on people who gamble, not affected others. And as he said, we know there are a lot of affected others. And her presentation was a little bit more focused on women, like use the term women. It was focused on what happens with women, because we know that, the drivers of violence against women are power inequities. And sometimes those inequities often related to financial inequities. And we see that with gambling. But I feel like my experience in gambling tells me, yes, gender matters in culture, but gender may or may not matter in terms of gambling, meaning a woman who gambles can perpetrate coercive and financial abuse over her partner in the same way. It goes kind of with gambling. So I'm going to say more about that, but I just want to say, like, some of this is really kind of focused on what happens to women, because that's the way it was presented. I don't have research to contradict that, and I understand the culture we live in and what happens. But anyway, so one of the things that is important to focus on is gambling doesn't cause intimate partner violence, but it's part of that intersectionality. And that's, the more you look at this, the more you understand. It's kind of the same, similar with substance abuse. It definitely can be connected if both things are present in either order. So there might have been intimate partner violence or domestic violence prior to gambling, or it might have happened consequently to gambling. So, it definitely connects. And one of the things that's really hard with gambling is it's generally treated as physical assault of some form. But when you're looking at gambling, it's coercive or economic abuse that is really prevalent in terms of what is perpetrated on the victims. It's also really important to understand the stigma that goes with gambling alone, and what happens to people who are the victims of both domestic or intimate partner violence or abuse and a gambling disorder. It's exponential, the shame and the stigma that goes with that. So, and economic abuse is highly prevalent, is the term they used. I think that it's probably almost 100% for anyone experiencing intimate partner violence where there is a gambling disorder in place. Next slide. So, forms of coercive control and economic abuse, it's one of the techniques used by all abusers, and those with a gambling disorder are no different. Secrets and lies are primary symptoms of disordered gambling, and they're often about either time or money. So much so that it's not uncommon for a significant other to think their partner is involved in another intimate relationship when they have a gambling disorder. Sadly, they may initially be relieved to find out their partner's other love is time spent gambling. But as the truth unfolds, persons affected by a partner's gambling are deeply hurt, both emotionally and financially. It involves controlling financial instruments, like using the victim's accounts, applying for credit in the victim's name, forging the victim's signature on tax returns, refinancing joint property, withdrawing the victim's retirement funds, not paying the bills, withholding necessities, including food and medicine. If there is a pre-existing power imbalance, extreme control over the victim's spending or punishing the victim's spending can occur. Or access to all funds can be completely cut off. Next slide. So one of the things that was also highlighted was that women in particular, this was focused on women, and I know it could happen, often seek solace in gambling, and it's one of the risk factors that they face for gambling disorders. Gambling venues, particularly land-based casinos, provide a welcome environment for women who are seeking solace from a troubled home. There's nowhere you can live in Connecticut now that there isn't within 50 miles of a casino, which means it's readily available geographically. There's also free buses and easy transportation if you don't have resources or a car. There's still ways to get there. And a woman walking in alone doesn't bring any unwanted attention to herself. Nobody, it's not unusual actually, which is one of the interesting things about a casino. It's a safe space. There's lots of women there alone. Nobody really notices you. And women who are victims of domestic violence have reported, like, yeah, it's a safe place for me to go. Nobody's going to notice maybe if I have a bruise on my face. Nobody's going to notice me if I'm trying to disappear. It's just the perfect place to go. It's also true that no one is going to come in and drag you out of a casino against your will without consequences from law enforcement, because there's cameras everywhere, there's security guards everywhere, and no, there would be a response if somebody were perpetrating violence on you in a casino. It's definitely a risk factor. And people who've lost any significant relationship are also really at a high risk for escaping. And we're going to talk more about what gambling does for people later. But I wanted to highlight it here as people in abusive relationships often have a really difficult time making the choice to leave. So it's a really tearing separation for them, in the same way that the loss of any significant relationship is, regardless of the difficulties of it. A significant loss is a very high risk factor for seeking solace in gambling. And that was the point I wanted to make there. Next slide. So one of the things that this presentation that I saw also did, which I thought I really liked, it's sort of, we talk about the risk factors and the problems all the time. And this was also about how to empower survivors. And it was particularly about empowering survivors of domestic or intimate partner violence. And I'm focused a little bit here on how do we empower survivors of people who've lived with somebody with a gambling disorder, because they have suffered great economic harms depending upon how the relationship was set up in the first place. But I've heard enough stories to know that it is incredibly difficult because gambling is hidden. And if you don't know for a long time that this is happening to you, the harm you can suffer is really severe. And I think that's one of the differences that I've seen in, say, living with someone with a substance use disorder. The fact that they have a substance use disorder kind of gets obvious to you after a while. It's hard to come home or be intoxicated without it becoming obvious at a certain point. You can gamble for 2 or 3 years if you're good, without your spouse or significant other knowing that this is going on, especially if you're the person who can control the finances in the family. And clearly, in most families, one partner has more responsibility for at least paying the bills than another. A lot of things are shared jointly, but there are often, I've heard a lot, it's like many people, even in healthy relationships, are like, oh, good, you do that. I have no interest whatsoever. Well, when that happens with a gambling disorder present, it's really a formula for some pretty severe abuse. So it's really significant when you're working with survivors or with people in a difficult situation to understand that one of the biggest regrets that women who've been through this say is that they regret not asking or knowing more about what was going on in the first place. That's true of both genders. It's a self-blame thing, but it's like, why didn't I take more responsibility in the first place to understand what was going on? It's a really hard conversation because people have emotional conversations about money can be incredibly volatile, either within a relationship or even in a therapeutic context. Money has an emotional content to it for almost all of us. And usually, it's really important to work with people on what their values are around money, because they learn them from their family, they learn them from culture. We're all unique in that way, but it's really important to get our values in order to help remove some of that incredible emotional volatility or defensiveness. And it's also really important. It's in the world much more today, but it's really important that people know what their financial situation is, what's your credit history, what's going on in your credit report. Some of the ways that coercion gets perpetrated would be identified immediately if people were really aware of their credit report. And I'm saying people, I'm really talking about women. you would know someone took a mortgage out on your house that you didn't sign. You would know if the IRS filed a tax lien on you. These are not gross exaggerations. These are things that happen all the time to people who are the victims of somebody with a gambling disorder. So, and the next slide. So, as Jeremy noted earlier, like 63% of those with a gambling disorder reported perpetrating or being the victim of intimate partner violence. Like 63% in that study. That's an incredibly high number. And I realize the study isn't brand new, but I'm not sure that it would be any different, if not worse today. So, you know, I don't have data on this, and we don't really look at this, but I think if you work in the world of addiction and trauma, you could kind of assume that there's a vicious cycle going on here, because people who develop addictive disorders are really, really likely to have experienced ACEs, right? 64% on this slide, or even higher. There's certainly a lot out there in the addiction world that says, you know, probably nearly 100% of people with an addictive disorder may have experienced some level of ACEs. And I think that we see the continuation of intimate partner violence among people who've experienced ACEs. It's really this cycle that needs to be broken. So, you know, most of what I first learned about real trauma, I learned in 12-step rooms. So I was part of a 12-step Gamblers Anonymous program that was women-owned. And there were maybe a dozen women in it. And of the dozen women, and I came in with a really severe gambling disorder. And, you know, the irony of this story is they were more than happy to ask me what was on the other side of my fence. Like, it was common conversation for them to talk about what traumas they had experienced in their life, because the group was that tight. You know, it wasn't invasive. It was really intended to be healing. But, you know, I didn't have the experience they did. So I was sort of like, geez, I don't know. You know, you don't know what you don't know. And especially if you don't know how you define trauma, which is, I think, also what happens to a tremendous number of people with addiction. They have no knowledge or awareness of what trauma really is. And I understand that's the point of trauma-informed care, is to help elicit from them, you know, in a real way, how they can talk about experiences that they might not even either be aware of or ever have talked about before. But this group, I mean, I want to say, it still takes my breath away today when I realize the stories of the women in that room. Like, things that I had seen on TV, but really could not have believed that I was sitting in a room with women who were healing from that kind of trauma. And now remember, it's a 12-step gambling meeting. And I also didn't just go to that meeting. I also went to meetings that were mixed meetings. And it was really healing for me, actually, to hear some of the men in that room address their past and their trauma in order for them to get better. You know, and I understand it happens therapeutically, but I just want to say, in real good 12-step therapy, 12-step rooms, it also helps there. And it's incredibly helpful for people to have that as a shared experience. So, you know, there's whatever data is out there, I'm not really sure, but I learned a tremendous amount from people who've really been through it and healed from it, and the different methods that they've used. So I think that, you know, I tell that story because I want everybody to be aware who works in it, that really, I know it goes with substance use disorder. It also goes with gambling disorder. It's really, really prevalent. And if folks aren't talking about it, they probably just aren't talking about it. So, and I think I get to hand it back to Jeremy now.
Thanks, Val. In terms of gambling and post-traumatic stress, about 19% of participants in this study met criteria for lifetime diagnosis of PTSD. Those presenting with histories were more likely women, had a lifetime substance use disorder, had significant lifetime major depressive disorder, dysthymic disorder, anxiety, as we can all imagine, and used gambling as a way to cope with some of these negative emotions, right? So gambling, you know, it's not only about the excitement and the wins that a lot of people think about with gambling and the money. It does serve an ulterior purpose when dealing with negative emotions. We'll talk a little bit about that. So let's see. Sorry, oops. I can't see like my whole slide, which is really bothering me. So gambling losses can be like traumatic events, right? Going in, expecting to win, and then losing, can create, you know, some of these responses. For folks who are dealing with trauma, it can cause some re-experiencing of their own previous traumas. It can also increase arousal that can kind of mimic it. You know, we could have some sleep disturbances, some irritability, poor concentration, restlessness. Gambling can serve as a way of numbing out. I've had plenty of people that I've seen over the years who talk about, you know, just the design of some of the games. Like we'll take slot machines, for example. Slot machines are designed to be a numbing form of gambling. So it doesn't require a lot of thought, right? You just push the button, the reels do their thing for the most part, and you can just sit there and numb out. And if anybody's been to a casino recently, or the next time you go to a casino, because there's plenty of events and things that happen there, look around, and you can see people sitting in front of machines just numb, right? They're just zoned out, they're in the zone. And that's, you know, that's something that can be very appealing to folks who are dealing with significant issues. I've had clients, actually had a client who had had a diagnosis of anxiety and all kinds of other issues, and she had like a social anxiety, and normally she couldn't go out in public. She didn't feel comfortable. She would have panic attacks. But the one place where she found solace, the casino. And you think that would be the last person you would find somebody at the casino with all these people. But, you know, it kind of speaks to the fact that, you know, she talked about being able to go sit in front of her favorite machine, sit down, be around other people, and just play the game and just tune out. And it really wasn't about her winning or losing. It was just about being kind of about what Val was talking about, being in a safe environment, and she could just numb out, and she could just, you know, have a good time in her mind. So it can help people kind of dissociate a little bit, which can be problematic, right? If we start to use that as our coping mechanism. But that's some of the anecdotes we've heard over the years. You know, gambling can also be seen as a solution for many folks, you know, so it can be seen as, you know, a way of undoing things where, you know, maybe you're in a tough situation, and maybe, you know, you get a windfall of some sort, and now you can go and do things that you normally couldn't do, right? It can help you focus on other things, not on some of the traumas and things that you're working through. There's that sense of safety. A lot of people talk about feeling, you know, maybe people who are just struggling with post-traumatic stress or other types of traumas. You know, it's a way that they, you know, sometimes talk about, you know, kind of feeling numb. You know, having the ups and downs of gambling can help them feel alive, right, and alert, and, you know, invigorated. So it does, you know, kind of works both ways. Gambling can be a form of self-medication for folks. You know, we've certainly heard, you know, plenty of people talk about being more happy when they're participating in gambling, when they're focused on something. You know, people who bet on sports, you know, that preoccupation with making their picks and following, you know, it helps them escape. You know, it can be very stimulating, right? So sitting and watching a match or watching a game or you know, sitting at a table, that anticipation of placing the bet and the outcomes can be very stimulating. It can also be numbing out, as I mentioned. You know, depending on the type of game a person plays, you know, it can serve different purposes. So the numbing out, the slot machines, the more passive type games, it can help people kind of just deal and cope. And it also helps with anxiety, as mentioned. You know, some people who suffer from anxieties, you know, they're able to kind of focus, tune in, and forget about those intrusive thoughts that may cause some of those anxiety symptoms. We talked before about co-occurring of gambling and substances. This just kind of reiterates that fact that oftentimes, you know, gambling and substance use co-occur, typically alcohol, which shouldn't be a big surprise, right? If you go to a casino, you sit at a machine or you sit at a table and you can get complimentary drinks while you're gambling. So, you know, the industry kind of knows their market, and they know, you know, it keeps people going. And, you know, you sit somebody at a table and you give them free drinks, you know, their inhibitions are lowered. They're more likely to place higher, keep betting. Also, if you've ever been to a casino and you've ordered a complimentary drink, it takes an incredibly long time for them to bring that drink to you. So you're going to sit there and you're going to play while you're waiting for your drink, right? So there's lots of a strategy to these things. But we know for folks who aren't casino gamblers, who gamble in the community, it's not uncommon for even lottery folks, you know, people who pay the lottery, you know, they'll go to a convenience store, they'll buy a nip or some alcohol along with their scratch-off ticket or their lotto tickets. They often go hand in hand. You know, it commonly occurs with other substances as well, tobacco and marijuana use in particular. And some of these, you know, things are highlighted. We also know there's a co-occurring nature with opiates. But what, you know, some of these things are highlighted because, you know, what happens oftentimes is because of the lack of funding for research, for gambling specific research, oftentimes you'll see a study that's on tobacco use or marijuana use. And, you know, what will happen is they'll include a couple of questions on gambling. So you'll see more data on gambling and tobacco use, say, or marijuana use, just because we're able to incorporate questions into some of those existing surveys and data. So if anybody's curious why it's always alcohol and tobacco and marijuana, that's why. But we do know that it co-occurs with many other substances, cocaine, opiates. There's just not as much research on those things currently. Males, younger adults, and those with lower socioeconomic status have higher risk of gambling. We found that in our impact study. It's, you know, pretty universal across the globe. Alcohol use, tobacco use, marijuana, like we mentioned. Problem gambling is typically, you know, the highest rates of problem gambling at the moment, although it's starting to really become more of a 50-50 with males and females. But historically, it's still predominantly males, different racial groups, disenfranchised groups, lower socioeconomic status, particularly with lottery. People that play the lottery the most tend to be the least educated, with the least income in our society. So we're really, it's a really big issue that, and you think about where lottery retailers are. There's about 28 lottery retailers in our state, not counting now that we have online lottery, which is a whole different thing. So with 2,800 lottery retailers throughout the state, and if you were to look at where some of these retailers are, you can go on the lottery website and check these things out. They're, a lot of times they're in urban areas, high concentration in inner cities. It's just, that's where the market is. We've gone into like Bridgeport, and we've had some conversations with store owners. This corner store, you see a corner, every corner has a corner store. They all sell alcohol and lottery products. And talking with them, you say, well, why do you sell lottery products? Have you thought about not selling lottery? Not that we're trying to, turn people away, but just asking, having a conversation. And it's all about, they're like, well, we understand the lottery and alcohol use is an issue, but if we don't sell it in our store, people won't shop with us anymore, right? So that's a real issue too on a business standpoint, is that these some of these vices and things like that are a way of maintaining business. So, but we are seeing higher rates within some of these groups, and so we have some targeted interventions for education and outreach for these particular groups. We recently worked with a marketing firm to create a multicultural campaign. So hopefully you'll start to see some of those things out in the community more often. And we certainly will talk more about that as things roll out. We're also working with the Connecticut Council on Problem Gambling on a multicultural outreach with some targeting certain particular groups at higher risk than others. So hopefully in the future, we'll be able to come back and we can talk about that work with this group as well.
It's interesting that when we look at this group of individuals that's at a higher risk for suicide than maybe some other groups, although given the prevalence now of suicidal ideation with young men, it's not clear to me who it's all being compared against, but it is clear to me that these groups are also groups who may be at a higher risk for a gambling disorder. We know veterans are at a higher risk than the average population. Again, Jeremy did that slide earlier where he said, how many times veterans were more likely to have a gambling disorder. Tribal populations, it's also true for tribal populations who, often it's a double-edged sword on tribal lands that casinos are a significant source of revenue, in fact, really enhance the tribe, but it's also right there on tribal lands. I'm going to say a little bit more about LGBTQ youth or individuals later. But certainly certain industries and occupations, and the ones that are listed on this slide in terms of suicide, I'm less familiar with than, say, first responders. I've gotten much more information on how vulnerable first responders are to suicidal ideation or suicide attempts. And people with disabilities are like 4 times more likely to have attempted or have had suicidal ideation. And I think that, women and girls with disabilities are 2 to 4 times more likely to experience domestic violence than other populations. So again, when I look at this information, I'm looking at, what Kristen Beal kept talking about. There's intersectionality going on here. They're at higher risk for gambling disorder. They're at higher risk for suicidal ideation, and they're at higher risk for domestic violence or intimate partner violence than the general population. And I think it's really significant to note that. And hopefully somewhere down the road, we do get better research about, what's really happening here and interventions and prevention initiatives among these populations. So, the risk factors for suicide and gambling disorder look very similar. So again, it's a repeat of the point I was trying to make on the last slide. It's like there's an interconnectedness to all of this. We have one of the things Jeremy just talked about was substance use disorder, and having co-occurring gambling disorder with a substance use disorder, which you would it may be the highest risk for suicidal ideation in terms of the studies that we have. But one of the things that we see we see a whole list of things in both categories: substance misuse, a history of depression or other mental illness. And we know that gambling as a co-occurring disorder there's a high prevalence of co-occurring disorders with gambling. The trauma and ACEs study, current or prior history of adverse childhood experiences, relationship issues, or recent losses. I'd point that out before. Your age, a sense of hopelessness in your life, and that happens emotionally, but it also really happens to people financially. And I know I'm talking about finances. Gambling isn't about money. There's no part of that I believe, but it is significant in our culture if you have no money. Anyone who's experienced that could attest to that. Jobs, financial problems, criminal and legal problems. The criminal justice system does no one with an addiction any favors. And it is not at all equipped to deal with the things that brought somebody there, let alone the aftermath of their addiction. And chronic pain is another thing that I hear really often in gambling disorders. People seek relief, and for folks who are not, for some reason, at risk, or they have a boundary around substance use disorders, gambling is often really, really attractive to them. It's a different value system that they may have in place that they may have learned when they were young. So gambling looks pretty attractive and pretty legal, whereas, illicit substances might be crossing a line they're not willing to cross. So next slide. So suicidal ideation were associated with having any financial debt, having chronic physical illness, experiencing depression, mood disorders, or alcohol use disorder. 31% of the time. 17% of those had suicide plans, and 16% actually made suicide attempts. Suicide attempts were also associated with being older and having a childhood history of sexual abuse, as well as experiencing depression, mood disorders, or alcohol use disorder, some other behavioral health disorder. So all of the co-occurring nature of all of these things is really significant to know. People may present with one thing, but the odds are very high that they really need to be assessed and treated for all of them. And maybe the next slide. So I'm going to segue now into a little bit of research that has just begun to be done on LGBTQ populations. And part of the reason I wanted to put this in this is the intersection of LGBTQ, adverse childhood experiences, a history of trauma, suicidal ideation. Again, it's a population that is uniquely vulnerable for a lot of reasons. So Dr. Michelle Malkin, who has presented in Connecticut before, she is at Eastern Carolina University, and she has a grant for a gambling research and policy initiative. And she's studying certain unique things. And it's significant, not because it's her, but because she actually has a grant to do some of this research that we talk about not having. We don't have research about the criminal justice system and gambling. We don't have research about LGBTQ issues and gambling. And she is participating in 5 or 6 new studies, of which they're not done. I mean, these are just collaboratives that have just begun, but it's really significant gender-based research in terms of gambling. And And these are some excerpts from her web page, which is, you know, LGBTQ individuals are reported to have experienced mental health issues at a higher rate. They face issues that result in increased strain, including lack of access to adequate and culturally competent healthcare, discrimination in employment, housing, bullying, violence, and education. And bullying is not a small thing. It comes up constantly in that community. It also comes up in any kind of gaming disorder training that we do, where online bullying is very, very real and very significant in terms of gender-based things. Young women are bullied online at an incredibly high rate in the gaming world. So are LGBTQ folks. They tend to be drawn to that world, and then they're bullied within it. So it's a really significant, it has really significant impact on developing disorders that people are treated as other and not accepted. So it's also been historically true that the LGBTQ population is reluctant to seek help because they have a difficult time finding competent counseling and healthcare. And her research is considering that, you know, they're more prone to self-medicating behavior because we know that that population is more prone to substance use disorder. And it also appears like on the next slide, Jeremy, you want to put it in there, that the studies that have been done so far don't show a correlation between men who have sex with men and a gambling disorder versus other men, but they do show a correlation about women who have sex with women having rates of gambling disorder that are higher than the general population of cisgendered women. There's also evidence that gambling disorder affects older LGBTQ adults at a disproportionate rate. And we know that older adults in general, you know, have a decent rate of gambling. Some of the rates, I'm going to say something about that later, but one of the things that I think is important is we're presenting here today, and we don't have research on all these populations. But 3 years ago, we implemented online gambling, and we've seen this incredible shift in a demographic where all of a sudden there's a lot more young men. So I want to make the point that this stuff is all really still significant, because whatever the percentages are is irrelevant, because it didn't cause one bit of decline in terms of LGBTQ folks or other populations. It's just this expanding world where there's more and more people gambling. There's not less of any given population gambling. And there was one study done on transgendered adolescents indicating that 11% of transgendered adolescents met the criteria to be further assessed for a gambling disorder. I would also venture to say that there's a relationship with gaming going on in that population. And I do think there's probably research that exists. I just didn't have time to put it together at the moment. And I wanted to point out in talking about the LGBTQ stuff that the violence that women and girls experience isn't just based on their gender. 61% of bisexual women and 44% of lesbian women experience intimate partner violence, compared to 35% of cisgendered women. So it isn't about your gender or the gender of the person you're with. And Black and African American survivors of domestic violence or intimate partner violence are way disproportionately more likely to be criminalized by the legal system, becoming re-victimized. women and girls with disabilities are 2 to 4 more times likely to experience it. And younger women are more commonly abused by an intimate partner than older women. And I think that, again, it isn't just gender, it's these other intersectional things that really play into some of it. And I do believe that part of what the research that I heard at National is people are looking at, addictions in terms of how does that play into it, and how does gambling addiction play into it, because there is a correlation.
And we do draw the distinction. I probably should have said this before, between lottery and casino. Lottery and casino, we kind of see them, although they're both gambling, we see them as two different products, right? So if you think about the casino or casinos in general, you think about the advertisement, the marketing around them, they are entertainment venues mostly, right? You go there, it's entertainment. There's other things attached to it. There's food, so on and so forth. Gambling, lottery, on the other hand, is about hope and opportunity. So the marketing for lottery is really around life-changing events. I always say this in my presentations. One of my guilty pleasures, I guess, is there's a show, I think it's HGTV, My Lottery Dream Home, where these people bought a lottery ticket and now they had a life-changing event and now they can purchase the home of their dreams. Great story. And at the beginning of every show, David, who's the host, he says, "Tell me about your experience." And they say, "Well, I was driving home from work, very common story. I bought a lottery ticket and now I can buy this gorgeous home in the Hamptons that I couldn't afford." So they sell two very different things. Lottery isn't coined as entertainment. It's really about life-changing events, and that's why it appeals to a much different market. So what can you do? So again, I think it's really important. I'm glad that we were able to sit in front of you today and share some of this information. There's just so much more to unpack. We could do hours and hours and hours. So you could visit, our website. You can visit the Connecticut Council on Problem Gambling, National Council on Problem Gambling. There's always opportunities to learn more on specific topics in different areas. We just brushed on the idea of gaming. There's a high correlation of video gaming. There's an element of video games that now incorporate gambling that a lot of people aren't aware of. Those who have kids, we know it exists, but so we're kind of getting this next generation of folks, are experiencing gambling in a much different way through video games. So we do a whole series on that. So what you can do is become more aware of gambling and problem gambling, educating yourself about resources that are available, informing your communities, informing the people that you're working with, having materials available. So we have materials available. You can reach out to us. You can reach out to the Connecticut Council. You can reach out to the Connecticut Clearinghouse. They have a bunch of materials. Have materials available. Be familiar with the materials that you're giving out to folks, and just have it there. Have it part of the conversation. One of the things we know is people aren't willing to disclose their gambling unless they're asked about it. So it's really important to have a conversation with people, not in a judgmental way, not in a way to say, let's see if you have a problem with gambling. Just have a conversation about gambling. What are people's relationship with gambling? Sometimes we like to not use the term gambling because gambling has its own kind of negative stigma attached to it. So we'll say, do you play the lottery? Do you buy scratch-off tickets? Do you go to the casino? So sometimes just naming the activities, it minimizes that stigma. Gambling it's a very heavy word, and oftentimes people gravitate towards some of these really extreme cases and they say, "Oh, it's not me, I don't gamble, but I do buy lottery tickets." It's very common for us to hear that. hosting gambling and recovery meetings or groups. There's, we don't have a lot of GA meetings in our state. We have a fair amount. I think there's like, I don't know, 20 or so, or 25, maybe a little bit more. In terms of Gam-Anon, there's like nothing. There's like 2 meetings, I think. So, if it's something that you have interest in, you could always reach out to Intergroup with Gamblers Anonymous or Gam-Anon. And if you're willing to host a meeting, they're always looking for places to host meetings where people might be interested. So you can be familiar with that process. Learn to ask questions, right? Find a valid and reliable screening tool. We have some on our website. Many of them are brief screeners, very minimal, 3 to 4 questions. So it's not going to add a ton to your intake process. But again, it's beginning to integrate and incorporate gambling conversation into all of the other work that you're doing, helping, and once we're talking about it, people are more likely to respond and talk about their experiences. And then we can get a better understanding of how we can help people even better. And then the other thing, I think Val mentioned it, something we always talk about is, as a taboo of an area it is, talking about money is really important. So when people are talking about money, they're talking about debt, maybe integrating some questions like, what do you do with your money? How do you spend your money? What is your relationship with money? Do you gamble with it? So all of these things are really important. And if we don't ask the question, oftentimes people aren't going to tell us. So it's really important that we initiate these conversations, and it can help us inform the work that we're doing with people and also educate people that we're serving.
Yeah, Jeremy, if I could just add one thing to what you said, and there's a lot more that could happen, and our resources are relatively limited. But I wanted to say, as a person with lived experience, if I want someone to talk about gambling, they're much, much more likely if there's a person with lived experience there. People will come up to me and tell me stuff that you could ask them directly and they might not disclose to you. But it's true when you think about yourself. It's like, when you see somebody that you can connect with, that it's something you might not have talked about otherwise. You could be like, hey, I kind of always wanted to like run this by somebody, but I didn't know who. And somebody who's disclosing, who's out there, is often a really good person. At least that's my experience with gambling. And I've been around for a long time now. And I'm not talking about other people in recovery. I'm talking about like people at the legislature, for example. I mean, they will disclose stuff because they need to. And so I encourage you to include and host people with lived experience for more visibility and accessibility to people who need help.